thank you all for joining. Welcome to our program titled ESG Related Trends in Executive Compensation. My name is Dario Mendoza and I'm an executive compensation attorney here at B&E. Now I want to take this opportunity to introduce my co-presenter today, Allison Hoinghouse from Alvarez & Marsal. Allison focuses on mergers and acquisitions, including golden parachute rules and bankruptcy compensation. She also works in executive compensation matters such as equity comp, the $1 million deduction limitation, qualified and non-qualified retirement plans, and payroll compliance. Allison helps her clients stay up to speed on emerging compensation trends, such as employment-related pandemic relief, gender racial pay equity, and the impact of environment, social, and governance efforts on compensation programs. Allison received a bachelor's degree in accounting and a master's degree in professional accounting from the McComb School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. Allison is a certified public accountant licensed in the state of Texas and a certified executive compensation professional through the World at Work organization. Okay, next slide. Now let's get into the main part of the presentation. We're going to start by discussing ESG performance metrics. Next slide. ESG's impact on compensation. Over the last few years, we've seen a dramatic increase in companies tying ESG to compensation. Just so we're on the same page, ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. Those three parts of ESG are interconnected by human capital. Companies have realized that their people are their strongest advocates and enablers of ESG strategy, and thus a key force for change. Hence, companies view human capital as the key to a successful ESG strategy. As a result, these concepts are intertwined. Studies have shown that a significant number of employees consider a company's ESG commitments when deciding where to work, and that employees are more likely to stay and more likely to be engaged at what they deem, quote, purpose-driven organizations. As a result, companies are evaluating how investment in ESG-related metrics can help them not only function effectively, but thrive sustainably. If we look at the diagram at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that ESG initiatives are key to recruiting and retaining employees. We've also seen a rise in compensation and rewards tied to ESG. Finally, company rules and regulations are impacted by these ESG initiatives as they require employee action to successfully implement. Next slide. On this slide, we have a quote. What gets measured gets managed has become what gets measured and built into corporate goals and individual KPIs and near and long-term compensation plans really gets managed. Maybe it's not as catchy as before, but it certainly reflects the current thinking. Again, we've seen a dramatic rise in tying ESG to compensation, both in near-term or short-term compensation, such as annual cash bonuses, as well as long-term compensation, such as equity-based awards or long-term cash awards. The general public, investors, shareholders, the SEC, proxy advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis have long been interested in how a company compensates its employees. Those same groups have also been interested in a company's ESG practices. It seems only natural that these two concepts would eventually become intertwined. What better way to prioritize ESG initiatives than to tie compensation to them? Some have called this paying well by paying for good. I think that's pretty fitting. Next slide. So in this slide, we've got a bunch of questions. When we're thinking about tying ESG to compensation, we really should be thinking about all of these questions. The who, the where, the what, the why, the when, and the how can be interpreted differently, but it is all part of a broader analysis of how to integrate ESG in compensation. Let's take a look at each question individually. So number one, who? Whose compensation is going to be subject to ESG metrics? Named executive officers, all executives, rank and file employees. In other words, whose behavior are we trying to incentivize? In many companies, the ESG metrics may be only limited to NEOs. At other companies, all executives may be subject to ESG, or for some companies, all rank and file employees. The second question, where? Where are the ESG metrics being applied? Stated differently, what type of compensation is involved? Are we talking about short-term compensation like annual cash bonuses? Or are we talking about long-term compensation such as equity awards, or perhaps both? The next question, what? What ESG metrics should be used? What sort of ESG initiatives are we trying to drive? Number four, why? Why are we looking to incorporate ESG into our compensation programs now? What's the driving factor? Is it shareholders? Is it employees? Something else? Number five, when? This refers to two different concepts of time. First, when should we implement ESG performance metrics for compensation? In other words, has our company reached the point at which an ESG metric is appropriate? Second, when should the performance metric be measured? Should it be over a 1-year period or something longer or shorter? Finally, how? How do we measure ESG? How do we apply ESG to compensation? As in, how do we determine the amount of compensation earned after determining performance with respect to the ESG metric? We'll discuss this one in a lot more detail later, but there are multiple approaches on how to address this particular question. And next slide. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Allison to cover the next few slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Dario. So we're going to dive into each one of those questions in a little bit more detail, but we're going to take it in a little bit of a different order. And then we're going to dig into some research that our group has conducted in this area within the industry. So we're going to start with the why. Why are people using ESG metrics? Why is this such a hot topic right now? Like many things in our world, the global pandemic, social justice, international conflicts really have brought a bunch of issues to head over the last couple of years. I mean, things like employee safety, diversity, inclusion, and climate change are just, a handful of things that have really been in the spotlight. And they're not new, right? They've been around, but just kind of the mix of these major crises in our world really shone a light on these matters and has caused a lot of just the general public to believe that more should be done in these areas. And as a result, they're really looking at what are companies doing in these areas to make improvements. There is now lots of different stakeholders who are looking over companies' shoulders and seeing what they're doing from an ESG perspective. So we have your normal investors to your shareholder advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis, customers and regulators are looking at this. In particular, one of the things we've seen several examples of recently is employee groups. So a band of employees kind of banding together to influence some in particular aspect of the company's ESG agenda as well. The Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS, did a survey last year. You can see over here on the right side of the screen that 86% of investors think that non-financial ESG metrics are an appropriate measure to incentivize executives. So I think that's pretty large majority of investors. And I think it really shows about the mentality of, if we're saying these are important initiatives, if these ESG efforts are really important, then essentially we should put our money where our mouth is and be sure that we're tying pay to performance in these areas that are really important. The other thing I just want to highlight there is the ISS survey points out, and this is very common terminology to refer to ESG metrics as non-financial. And a lot of times it's true, but a lot of times they are actually kind of, I think about it more as pre-financial, not in every case, but a lot of them are actually pre-financial, or in other words, might be more of a leading indicator rather than a lagging indicator of performance. So for example, if we take an oil field services company, maybe they're taking extreme measures to reduce cost, which can make the financial performance look awesome, right? Everything looks great. But then that can show up negatively in the cutting of corners. That might actually show up maybe first in something like a safety metric or maybe an environmental accident metric. That's just an example where you could see that if you have a major blow in one of those areas, it could cost the company, millions and millions of dollars. If, a major event like an unfortunate death of an employee or a large oil spill occurs that costs, millions and millions of dollars. So that's just, one example. Actually, a real life example, although it's from a different industry, is actually Equifax. So before they had what was the largest data breach in U.S. history several years ago, they had really strong performance. They were rocking their performance metrics and everything looked great. But shortly before the breach happened, there was a major rating institution that actually downgraded them to the lowest ESG rating possible because they viewed that they had a lack of data control and prior breaches that concerned them about ESG, and in particular around privacy of their customers. And so although it hadn't shown up yet in the financials, It's an example of how sometimes these ESG metrics, if we're keeping an eye on those, they might actually lead to evaluating something and maybe solving a problem before it does show up in the dollars. But ESG metrics, they can be challenging, right? Difficult to identify and quantify. They're not as standardized as a lot of our normal financial metrics that everybody's so used to. And it's important to ensure that when you're adding these metrics, it doesn't lead to some mismatch of the goals and motivations within the organization. Next slide, please. So when is a company ready to measure ESG performance? So as we just talked about in the last slide, it's very common and a very trending topic right now to tie compensation to ESG metrics. But one of the things I think about in this slide is I hear my mother's voice in the back of my head saying, you know, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do that too, right? In terms of, is this really what makes sense for everybody? Are you doing it the right way? So ESG is no different in terms of it's got to be done the right way, not just because everybody else is doing it this certain way. There's not a one size fits all approach that's going to work for everyone. So there's a huge difference we see obviously across industries. For example, you know, what makes sense for a software company versus an energy company is, you know, night and day. But even within the same industry, you know, there's a huge difference between what we see in clean energy companies versus a vertically integrated company, and even just company within a very similar operation kind of footprint. So what are some of the best questions to ask yourself as a company to see if now is the right time to really explore ESG metrics, and is there proper alignment within the organization? So first, you know, we always start with what are the goals and objectives of the company? What is the strategy that's really going to drive value creation within the company? And what's going to be material? Like there's things that maybe matter on the fringes, but really what's core to the company's business and overarching strategy? Second, you know, how is ESG already part of the agenda at both the management level as well as even the board level? I will say we're seeing a lot more questions and a lot more initiative coming straight from the board down into the organization than we ever have in the past around ESG, because there is such a focus in these areas to be sure that companies are properly, you know, managing risk in this area. What policies and practices are established within the organization already? One of the ones that comes to mind here is in particular within the energy industry is how there's often a very strong culture of safety that's already present within the organization. And how does that work with or even against some of these other ESG efforts that you may be trying to achieve? And finally, what about reporting or data collection mechanisms within the organization? This is one thing we see companies struggle with quite a bit at the beginning, because oftentimes we know where we might need to go down the road, but we don't necessarily have ways to track or measure some of those interim steps that need to occur to actually get to our end result there. So it's oftentimes quite a process to actually build up the support and tools that are needed to actually evaluate this process. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to shift into some of the questions that will kind of explore some of the research that our group has done specifically in the energy industry. So this is actually going to be a sneak peek from Alvarez & Marsal's 2022-2023 Energy Compensation Report that'll be released early fall. And that report's going to be much broader in terms of covering compensation levels, type of awards, CIC benefits, many more other compensation topics. But what we really wanted to kind of hone in today on is the results of the survey around ESG performance metrics. You can see here the list of 25 companies that were included in this research and we've broken them into 5 different sectors within the energy industry. So we'll explore these and see some commonalities, but also some differences depending on the type of energy and company that is included here. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to Dario to go into the first part of the research.
All right, thanks, Allison. So next slide, please. So out of the surveyed companies that Allison just showed, the data shows that all E&P and all integrated energy companies used ESG metrics. 4 out of the 5 midstream companies used ESG metrics, as well as 4 out of the 5 clean energy companies. Finally, only 3 out of 5 OFS companies did so. I want to be clear, though, that you shouldn't draw any industry-specific conclusions based on that data. The data should not be interpreted as E&P companies are doing better integrating ESG than OFS companies. Instead, what I want you to take away from this slide is the fact that the vast majority, 84% of the surveyed companies across 5 different industries, are using ESG metrics. And even if you were to look at each specific industry, you'll see that a majority of the companies surveyed within each industry are using ESG metrics. So I think that's a pretty good sign. ESG, as we've mentioned, repeatedly, it's seen a dramatic rise over the last few years, and we're certainly seeing that within the energy industry as well. Next slide. So
Great.
Allison, I'm going to kick it back to you for that one.
Absolutely. So as a compensation advisor, this is one of the questions we've gotten a ton over the last year in particular is, if we want to include an ESG metric, where should we include it? Should it be only in our annual incentive plan? Should it be only in our long-term incentive plan? Should we put it in both or neither? Are we not ready for this yet? By far, you can see here on the screen that ESG metrics are most commonly incorporated into the annual incentive plan. So if you add the blue and the red there, you can see 84% have it and at least one in their AIP plan. Now, I think a lot of this is due to just the increased pressure that we've seen recently with, including ESG metrics. And the organizations have really begun to try to accelerate their timeframes of actually making progress in these ESG areas, which has led companies to kind of naturally put it in their annual bonus plan to be sure that, executives are really focused on it immediately and these goals and objectives that they need to work towards right now. However, you'll see there was a handful of companies analyzed that did include ESG metrics in their long-term incentive programs as well. So you could see where this might make sense for some based on, a lot of the areas of ESG to make meaningful change. For example, say environmental, that's not something that's going to be fixed overnight, right? It's going to take years and years of investment before results may actually be realized in some of these areas. So in those circumstances, you could see where maybe including these metrics in long-term plans might actually align better from a timing perspective. The issue, though, is that, even doing that over a multi-year period is so much harder to project, especially in some of these kind of developing areas where we don't have a lot of, track record measuring these things. So that's why we still see this as very much a minority practice, but it will be interesting to see over the next several years if we see more companies start including this in their long-term incentive plan to really align with how long it might actually take to make meaningful change in these areas. Dario, next slide.
Okay, so what types of ESG metrics should be used? I think if you were to study financial metrics used by companies for performance-based equity awards, you might expect to see a lot of companies that are using a total shareholder return performance metric, for example. Of course, you're going to find other metrics, but that metric is going to be very common. On the other hand, for an ESG metric, if you were to study those, used by companies, you simply won't find a common shared metric because ESG metrics are so varied. That's partly because of how broad an umbrella is under ESG. Environment, social, and governance metrics can encompass many things. We've included a few examples in the slide, but those are by no means exhaustive. If you were to compare any 2 companies in the survey, they're going to use 2 completely different ESG metrics. It's a recurring theme, but there simply isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to ESG. However, we did review the ESG metrics utilized by the surveyed companies, and we tried to break those metrics down by category. So that's what the 2 charts at the bottom are showing. The chart on the left shows that out of the companies surveyed, the percentage of companies, or the overall prevalence of ESG metrics by category. As you can see, social and environmental are the most common categories being used for compensation. The chart on the right shows that out of the companies surveyed, the percentage of companies using each category of ESG metric. As you can see, 90% of the companies surveyed used some form of social metric, while 71% used some form of environmental metric. As the data shows, all types of ESG metrics are represented here. It's not like we have, any that are completely missing. Some might be lower, like governance, But companies within the survey are using all different types of ESG metrics, although environment and social do seem to be a little more common. With that, the next slide, I'll send it back to Allison.
Sure, and just to add on that too, I think one thing in particular there with the social being so high in this industry, I think as I mentioned earlier, safety being such a kind of well accepted metric within the industry. I think that's why we see social, so much higher as it falls into that. But I will say we're definitely fielding more questions too about, how is the right way for safety to be incorporated into a plan in terms of, keeping employees safe. Is that more appropriate as a modifier and really focusing more on some of the environmental and other metrics as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of evolves over time. Now moving on to how do you measure ESG performance? So oftentimes these metrics are just being added, right, to a whole slew of other financial or strategic metrics that are already being used in the compensation programs. So we evaluated how these ESG metrics are weighted relative to the other non-ESG metrics. So you can see here, clean is on the lower end with just shy of 10% being allocated to ESG metrics. And then on the other end, integrated had the highest at just over 25%. So on average, if you look across all the 5 sectors that we evaluated, it's not quite 80-20 in terms of the ESG weighting for metrics. And this is really consistent with what we saw with the E&P and oilfield service surveys that we did in 2021, which showed that by far the most common was actually like the 10 to 20% was the most common weighting for these type of metrics as well. But it definitely varies based on the sector. I think, as we'll talk about a little bit more later as well, the integrated is, this is not, they've been on this kind of ESG path for a lot longer. And so we see where they have a little bit higher weightings or a little bit more down the road and mature in this area. And it shows them being more comfortable allocating more to these areas. But I think it also speaks to importance and of strategy within the company of needing to really focus on some of these things like the energy transition. So the other thing I'll just point out here is that, recommend, and as you can see here, it's pretty rare for it to be much less than like say 10%. We've definitely seen where we want to be sure that these metrics are not too low where it isn't meaningful, and not where you're using too many metrics where it just gets lost in the shuffle, right? And executives don't really know what to focus on because there's not enough line of sight in any one sort of path. So again, that 10 to 20% tends to be very common because it's enough to garner a lot of attention, but it's not, so much that it's skewing maybe relative to other strategic or financial objectives. And Daria is going to get into this a little bit in the next couple of slides, but it also depends the weighting on how you're applying the ESG performance goals. And so he's going to talk about that in a second, but that definitely will impact how you weight it if you're doing kind of a scorecard versus a direct weighting. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dario.
Thanks, Allison. So next slide. Okay, so how do you measure ESG performance? And this is something we could spend a lot of time talking about. Just to kick off that discussion, I want to point out the chart that's in the middle of your screen. It shows out of the surveyed companies, 60% of those companies used an objective ESG metric, while 40% used a subjective ESG metric. And when talking about subjective versus objective, we're really talking about qualitative versus quantitative. For example, a subjective ESG goal that might be used by a company could be a specific individual's progress with respect to certain ESG matters, such as diversity and inclusion efforts or talent development or turnover and retention. That individual's achievement with respect to that goal would typically be determined by the board or the comp committee in its discretion. In other words, there are no specific targets to hit or achieve. It's entirely subjective. On the other hand, an objective ESG goal might be something like achieving a certain amount of waste reduction or reducing greenhouse gas emissions or carbon footprint by a certain amount. In those cases, there is a specific target to achieve. There are, of course, metrics that could be structured either way. Safety could be a subjective measure evaluated through simply the discretion of the board or the comp committee, or it could be an objective measure where specific targets such as decreases in accident or incident rates must be achieved. It goes without saying that there could be some difficulty with rigid goals. ESG metrics can be difficult to measure, but also difficult to forecast. Allison touched on this earlier. This could lead to situations where the ESG metric results in less compensation being paid out than was originally expected. This may result in companies having to take special action at the end of the year to adjust compensation payments upwards, which could in turn draw the attention of shareholders or ISS. For that reason, some companies may shy away from using objective performance metrics, at least until they get a better handle on their ESG priorities and progress and are better able to structure their ESG targets. To that end, we frequently see companies start to dip their toes in the water with respect to ESG by using a subjective measure early on with a small percentage of compensation tied to that particular measure. This allows the company to slowly develop its ESG strategy without potentially punishing employees if the company overestimates the level of achievement with respect to the ESG metric or target employed. Over time, the company will typically see them get more and more comfortable and start tying a larger percentage of comp to an ESG metric or using multiple ESG metrics, including objective ESG metrics predicated on specific targets. Next slide. So this is something that Allison alluded to a short while ago. So how do you apply an ESG performance goal? In other words, how do you determine the amount of compensation that's earned based on ESG performance? There's a few different approaches. And so we've summarized sort of the four main approaches that we typically see. But I'm sure there are other ways to calculate this. If we were to look at all companies, I'm sure some are using a combination of these, but we want to sort of give you an overview of the four main ones. So number one, weighted metric. An exact percentage of compensation is earned if the applicable target for an ESG metric is achieved. So that one's easy to understand. We've given an example there. So 10% of somebody's annual bonus might be based on a carbon footprint target. So if they achieve that target, they get that 10% of the bonus. Number two, scorecard. This is where a few different ESG measures are bundled together, and performance with respect to those measures on the whole is generally assessed to determine how much compensation is earned. So for that, you might have a category that just has 4 or 5 different ESG metrics. It might mention something about waste reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction, things like that. And it's all bundled into one category, and it's based at 30% of the bonus. And so there's sort of a discretionary element to it. It's not like the weighted metric in that you have to achieve a specific target. It's more of, we're going to evaluate your performance with respect to these 3 or 4 different ESG metrics, and we're going to decide how much of the 30% of that bonus you earned. Okay, number 3, modifier. ESG metrics serve as a modifier where compensation can be increased or decreased by a certain percentage depending on what ESG performance was. This one's probably the one you see the least, but I think some companies find it useful in that you could base the entire bonus on financial or operational metrics that you know and love. And so the entire bonus, could go up to 200%, based on those metrics. At the same time, if for some reason you didn't achieve the full 200%, you've got an ESG multiplier that if you did really well with respect to your ESG metric on the side, then it can take your bonus up to 200%. Conversely, if you did hit that 200% bonus amount, but your performance with respect to ESG wasn't so hot, then the board or committee could choose to decrease your bonus as well, simply because you didn't achieve, sort of their standard that they envisioned for ESG. And finally, individual. So this is where a discretionary assessment is made, usually on an individual by individual basis. For companies using this, we'll frequently see a few different financial or operational metrics comprising most of the annual bonus pool, and then a broad catch-all discretionary or individual category that'll mention that it's simply discretionary up to the board based on assessment of various things, and it might include ESG. To summarize this, there's no clear consensus on which approach to take. Out of the surveyed companies that we looked at, all of these different approaches were used. And if you look broader, at the S&P 500 or just, all companies generally, they're all going to be using, these various approaches. And I wouldn't say, one is more common than the other. We do see weighted metric quite a bit. We see scorecard quite a bit. Modifier probably is used a little less, but again, you will see all of these. And with the next slide, I'll send it back to Allison.
Great. And we're doing pretty good here on time, Dara. So I'm actually going to address a couple of the questions we've got from the audience here. One of them was specifically, what does social mean? Which that's a great point. So we kind of brushed past that, but is it specifically employee-based diversity? I would say that's one type of thing, metric that falls under social, but there's a lot of others. A lot of them are focused on the employee base, things like diversity and equity, inclusion, could be things like pay equity. It could be, your workforce composition or return to work rates from new parents. There could be a whole host of things, employee turnover, employee satisfaction surveys. Those are just, kind of a laundry list of a few things under social around employee base. But we also do see some others that are not necessarily employee related. So for example, maybe corporate charitable giving. We also see sometimes like community event participation and sponsorships and things like that. That's not necessarily directly the employees, but just furthering social, efforts within, your community. If I didn't get that all the way, please feel free to ask for further clarification on that question. And then the second one I'm just going to answer real quick is, and love your thoughts on this one, Dario, but the question is, if a company already has a metric in our AIP based on safety, HSE performance, but does not explicitly say the word ESG when describing this metric in the CDNA, would it be beneficial to recast the safety HSE metric as an ESG metric in order to get credit with shareholders, ISS, et cetera, for having ESG metrics and our AIP? So I'll just give my thoughts real quick, and then Dario, I'd love to hear what you're thinking. But I think most investors and shareholder advisory firms looking at that, if they see safety, they're going to give you a check for, the S under ESG. They'll recognize that, even if it's not necessarily, labeled ESG. Although it doesn't hurt to throw around that, terminology as well within your proxy. But I will say this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. There is kind of an evolving thought about, I kind of refer to it as like old ESG and new ESG. Safety kind of falls a little bit under like the old ESG in terms of it's already well established within the industry. And we're seeing more of a push that safety is not enough and that there's a push to move to some of these other ESG metrics like diversity and inclusion or other employee or human capital metrics. But Dario, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree, Allison. I do think most investor shareholders picking up the proxy or picking up the 10K are going to view safety as ESG. So you don't necessarily have to add a reference to ESG in there, but I do recommend it. I think, safety is an ESG metric. And so some shareholders, might be searching through the document, just looking for ESG references. And so in that sense, if they're doing that, safety might be overlooked. And so I do think it's worth referencing that. I do find that, a lot of companies are sort of updating their proxy disclosure to mention ESG as many times as they can. And so, in that sense, you could add references, when describing your bonus and describing that safety metric, just talking about how you have an ESG metric or an ESG component as part of that bonus, see the table or chart below and it mentions safety, or you can add a footnote to that table. At the end of the day, I don't think it hurts. And I do recommend including as many references as you can, just because I think some shareholders or investors might just be looking for that. Like I said, they might just be searching through the document, just trying to find those references rather than reading it. We all know, comp disclosures in the proxy have gotten very, very long, especially as the SEC keeps making us add more and more tables. So when you're digging through a 30 or 40 page, CDNA with tables, I certainly think an ESG reference, isn't going to hurt you, and it'll probably help you a little bit.
Great. We got one more question. I think actually fits really well into this. So I'm going to go ahead and take this one too. But the question is, can you talk more about modifier? Is it totally subjective? And what I would say here is just, it does not have to be subjective. It could be a very objective goal, but it doesn't have to be. It could be kind of either one. And give an example from one of my clients. It had normal kind of financial goals, but then there was a modifier where it was automatically, the payout was knocked down, a certain percentage if they had an extreme, either a fatality or extreme, work employee incident. And so that was an example where they wanted safety to be something they thought about, but really just as a negative modifier, because they kind of took the view as it's already part of our job to be sure people come home to their families at the end of the day. So it wasn't something that they wanted a positive thing in terms of measuring, but they wanted there to be a consequence if a major incident happens. So that's an example of a modifier where it was very objective in terms of what it was, but you can still have it where it's subjective as well. We saw that a lot during the pandemic in terms of kind of choosing, like might have had a modifier about some strategic initiatives, and that was very subjective, but still used as a modifier to maybe limit payout. I don't know, Daria, if there's anything you want to add on that one.
Yeah, I agree. Modifier certainly does not have to be objective. I've seen it subjective many times as well. Like Allison mentioned, I've seen it just be a negative modifier. I've seen it just be a positive modifier. I've seen it go both ways. Like we've been stressing, there is no one size fits all approach. So with respect to these metrics, we can really design them sort of however the company sees as the best approach. And so for the modifier itself, that can take many different forms.
Great. Well, thank you all. Those are great questions. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide, though, we're going to shift into examining just a few examples that we picked to really highlight some of the current trends and the ways that companies are disclosing their ESG efforts and the metrics around it. So this first example is from Shell's proxy statement, where it's outlining its annual bonus plan. This is an example of the weighted metric approach, where they specifically have 15% of the annual bonus allocated to two different metrics around energy transition. And then they have another 15% that's allocated to two different aspects of safety. So this is a good example of one where it's very specific and very detailed goals that fall under both the E and the S of ESG. And as I alluded to earlier, generally speaking, what we've seen is the integrated companies have been on the ESG path for a while now and tend to be more mature in this area, which has really lent itself to being able to actually measure ESG efforts more granular than maybe some other companies, because this is definitely not always the case where you have this specific and detailed with the measures and the performance levels and the weightings, all of that wrapped up together. But generally speaking, as we see as a company matures kind of in its life cycle and in its process of kind of this evolving ESG frontier, we tend to see movement more from the subjective goals to objective when possible. A lot of times, some of these, it's just not possible in terms of it. There's too many various factors, and it's really left up to the board's discretion to really evaluate how performance was. All right, Dario, I'll let you take the next one.
Okay, next, there we go. Okay, so next example, we're looking at an E&P company, EOG. So EOG uses ESG metrics in its annual bonus plan. And those metrics are certain operational, financial, and then strategic goals. As you can see, if you look down, it's the fourth row. So 7.5% of the bonus is tied to certain safety and environmental metrics, including reduction in methane and greenhouse gases, among others. In addition, 40% at the very bottom was based on strategic and other operational goals, which we assume likely included some subjective ESG analysis. So going back to our breakdown of the different approaches that can be used to apply ESG, this is an example of the scorecard approach. That 7.5% of the bonus is based on these different ESG metrics, but it's not like there's specific weightings like we saw for Shell. That 7.5% is not broken down into sub percentages based on achievement with respect to each individual ESG metric. So this is really sort of all of those metrics bundled together comprise 7.5% of the bonus without specific weightings. What's also interesting that I want to point out about EOG that's not necessarily covered on the slide is that 2020 is when they first introduced this separately weighted ESG goal. And that year they weighted it at 5%. So then they came back in 2021, and as you can see, they weighted it at 7.5%. So they got more comfortable, the next year. I believe they changed the metric as well. So there was some adjustment of the metric, also, this increase in the comp tied to the ESG metrics. For 2022, you can see they provided a little bit of forward-looking disclosure in their proxy, where they said that they increased the weighting from 7.5% to 10%. It's not clear yet whether the metric itself has changed as well. But that sort of tells the story that, Allison was just mentioning. Over time, companies get more comfortable with ESG metrics. They sort of figure out, how much comp they want to tie to it, what metrics are appropriate. And so they sort of settle into, adjusting it so that more comp is subject to the ESG metric. And moving towards sort of, more objective measures, less discretionary measures. So, EOG, I think, is a company that's clearly doing that. They've developed their ESG strategy, sort of 3 years in a row and made tweaks here and there. So another way of looking at it, companies get more confidence in their ESG metrics over time. Next slide. So I'll let Allison take this one.
I think that's a great point, Dario. I feel like more so than a lot of other metrics that are more, standardized like financial ones, we definitely see where there's kind of an evolution over the first several years of incorporating these, just because trying to figure things out, figuring out how to track it and tweak to get to the right proportion. All right, so now here looking at Baker Hughes. This is an example of a scorecard approach where ESG is just generally assessed as part of a broader scorecard of other strategic initiatives. So somewhat similar to the prior example, but you can see here, Baker Hughes, they had a 70-30 split between financial and strategic goals. But within that 30% strategic goals, about half of them related to ESG efforts. But it wasn't just ESG efforts. It had other things like capital allocation, shareholder returns, other things that could, potentially be done as, a very standalone metric. But here was really just folded in together to kind of be a holistic strategic initiative. But from an ESG effort, you can see it has everything from safety to diversity and inclusion. And they even have in here about revamping their compensation and benefits model because they kind of recognize that the future of work is going to look different, and that may impact how we go about compensating our various employee groups. So as you can see here, this is definitely more subjective, and the board, retained discretion to really evaluate at the end of the year, how well did they think management did in these various areas, and whether they met or missed or exceeded these various objectives. Also, this is an example where there is good detail about the categories for being measured, but again, it doesn't exactly say how they're going to be measured, which is pretty consistent with the scorecard approach, where the board is really left to determine in their own judgment how well the executive team did in these various efforts. Next slide.
And so, Allison, could we actually go back a slide real quick? We got a question, I think, on example 3. The question was, why are shareholder returns not financial? I don't know if I have a good answer for that. You see it there, number 4, strategic blueprint priorities. And so I might have said, okay, maybe they're focusing more on shareholder satisfaction or something like that. But it does look like, at the bottom of that chart, it's talking about TSR, it's talking about ROCE. I'm not sure why they, didn't move that over to financial. Maybe that's just, maybe strategic blueprint is just sort of a code name for, what they view as certain priorities. So it's not necessarily just strategic goals. Like we might think of ESG as strategic. They might just be throwing that in there because that's just simply a blueprint priority. Allison, any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that is we sometimes see this exactly how they have it here, but you're right. A lot of times a TSR or ROIC might be in its own standalone financial metric. That's actually really common. We sometimes do see it in these strategic where they don't necessarily want to put hard numbers on it out in the public about what they're measuring, or we sometimes see where it gets wrapped into the strategic blueprint because sometimes it might actually be referring to like M&A activity. I've seen that before too, where they don't want to put it out there that they're trying to like hire people and that's how they're going to get their TSR, if you will, hit the TSR goal. So they kind of wrap it in this more generic strategic stuff. So they're not saying, hey, we're going to go on a buying spree or something like that. So that could be part of it. This is not a specific company that I'm familiar with, but just kind of speculating why companies might handle it a little differently. Again, I think a lot of it may come back to just giving the board more discretion to determine what they think is fair.
I think that's right. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to look at a clean energy company, Ameresco. It bases its annual incentive program on a variety of goals that you can see there. They've got a lot of different specific metrics with targets and everything. And down there at the very bottom, you see ESG goals sort of mentioned, and it's got a 5% weighting. Unfortunately, the proxy doesn't provide us any detail on what ESG goals means. They do provide plenty of detail on what the other metrics are. So our best guess is that ESG goals means just an individual approach, going back to those approaches we mentioned earlier, a discretionary sort of individual by individual look at how they are doing with respect to ESG goals. And so this would be a subjective, discretionary evaluation. We expect the board or the comp committee is looking at that and just deciding how much of that 5% that someone earns. So if we looked back at their filings, my guess is, this company maybe has just started introducing ESG, because as we've mentioned a few times, we see companies start out subjective and maybe start moving more towards objective measures. But this one seems to be a straight subjective measure. Next slide. I think Allison's going to cover SunPower.
Absolutely. This is an example we wanted to include because it's an example where an ESG metric is included for the performance-based equity awards, so included in their long-term incentive component. And this is also an example of a weighted metric. So you can see here that 10% of it was based on hitting this annual safety metric. And then the other two were financial goals. But wanted to point this out because it's still an annual performance metric. This example is where the safety was based on hitting that year's goal from a safety perspective. But then the award did vest over, I believe it was a 4-year period based on continued service thereafter. But it still was included and tied into the long-term incentive component. Conversely, we do see, but it's again a very minority practice where whatever the entire performance period or vesting period is tied to the performance period. So for example, it being measured over 3 years, if it's a 3-year award, not just 1 year and then a subsequent time-based vesting. So there's a lot of flexibility here. I think again, the few examples we see in the long-term incentive component here often are using something like this, like an annual metric for safety, because it's easier to measure some of these things. It's harder. Some of the other ESG type metrics, it's a lot harder to maybe project out 3 or 4 years and set what is a reasonable goal. Again, just because this is an area that's evolving so quickly. But as I mentioned earlier, you could see on certain types of ESG metrics that the length of time it actually takes to succeed in some of these areas can be a lot longer, where we might see more adoption in an LTIP program. Back to you, Dario. Next slide.
All right, thanks, Allison. So next slide. And this is our final example. It's a midstream company, MPLX. They base 20% of their annual cash bonus program on ESG performance measures. The remaining 80% is pre-established financial measures. That 20%, it's sort of similar to the Shell example, where they've broken it down into 4 specific goals. So we've got greenhouse gas intensity, process safety events rate, designated environmental incidents, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are all weighted at 5%. And as you can see, they've provided a great amount of detail here as to what the targets are, what the payouts are, and everything, and then the performance they achieved for last year as well. So that's all in there. One thing I want to point out is that 20%, that's a fairly high percentage of comp allocated to ESG metrics. The other thing I want to point out is the diversity, equity, and inclusion target. It looks like they based that on a certain percentage of external hires being women or racially diverse, and so that's a level of detail you typically won't see. So it's sort of interesting that they've put that out there and go into that sort of level of detail. Usually, the diversity and equity and inclusion metrics, you'll see that as more of a subjective metric a lot of times. But no, MPLX clearly has got a defined ESG strategy, and they have got specific targets that they're looking to achieve, and they've tied compensation to it. So I think that's an interesting example for sure. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that wraps up our look at ESG performance metrics. We've got a few minutes. We'll try to go quick on this next part. The next slide, I'll let Allison just give us a brief summary of what we just talked about.
Sure, and we'll pivot quickly to our last little topic here, but to wrap up on ESG performance metrics, obviously it's evolving area, as we've said before. There's a lot of nuances and differences that make sense for one company, but not another. So we just always recommend, being very thoughtful through this process, avoid overcommitting goals that are not realistic, and especially not realistic within a certain time period. But Dario, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you for the next section.
Sounds good. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to quickly, we've got 6 minutes or so. We're going to cover some other ESG considerations. Next slide, please. So gender, racial pay equity, that falls under the ESG umbrella. And there's a number of companies these days that are evaluating pay equity, and some have tied compensation to progress with respect to pay equity. This has also been an area of increased focus for state legislatures, government agencies, who have moved quickly to investigate pay equity compliance and enforce pay equity laws. A tight labor market, particularly since COVID, has certainly impacted pay equity. Many companies have found, either through a self-audit or claims raised by employees, pay equity issues. Sort of related issue, is wage compression, where more tenured workers might earn less than new hires simply because they've been there longer. And just with the job market being the way it is, having to attract new talent requires, richer and richer offers. As we all know, there's been a greater push for companies to be more transparent about pay equity, certainly in their public filings and disclosures. With that in mind, we really want to stress that it's important for companies to be aware of these potential issues. It's worth conducting a self-audit, implementing guidelines to help evaluate pay equity issues. We think that the spotlight on pay equity is only going to get brighter in the coming years. Just to give one example, and I don't want to scare anybody, but Illinois has a law going into effect in 2024 that would require companies to certify compliance with all state and federal pay equity laws, or be subjected to a 1% fine on gross profits. That's pretty steep. I don't think there's going to be every state in the country adopting a law like that, but the fact that Illinois has adopted that and it's going into effect in 2 years, I think pay equity is certainly something that needs to be on the radar for companies. Next slide.
So how does a company, practically look at pay equity? So here we just outlined a very high-level approach that we take when helping clients. So first, starting with an initial diagnostic, figuring out, we take a bunch of payroll data and run a lot of statistical analysis and data manipulation to really figure out, are there any irregularities between gender, race, or this can also apply to several other types of protected classes as well. And this is also where I immediately pick up the phone and I call Dario, because this is one where we definitely recommend legal counsel being involved from step one. Ideally, both internal and external legal counsel, to be sure that you protect any sort of attorney-client privilege if you do find any issues. So once you go through that, pretty much always we find something on the first pass that looks weird or kind of raises a red flag. We really dig into those examples and figure out, is there really a rational reason that there is a difference besides gender, race, or some other protected class? Oftentimes there are things that you can explain, because it is hard for statistically to control for everything. So oftentimes when you dig into it, maybe it's education or performance ratings or some other thing that might explain why they're paid more, if it's kind of a pay for performance type thing. But I will also caution that oftentimes in those exact same factors that may explain the differences, they're also ripe for unconscious bias. So companies need to be really careful and thoughtful as they're looking through those initial red flags. And then if there are still legitimate discrepancies that exist, we move into correction mode and try to resolve the issue while still mitigating as much as we can from a financial and a legal exposure.
All right, next slide. Okay, so on this slide, we've included a few key considerations for pay audits broken down by categories. So first, on data, you're going to want to ensure that you gather, broad data that's detailed enough. There's a lot of different categories that you should be looking at in your pay audit. For timing, you'll want to conduct regular audits. It might be easiest to set it up around the time that your annual compensation decisions are made. And finally, on scope, the self-audit may only be the first step. This may lead to additional studies or need for additional information. Or for example, you might look at doing a market analysis of how your comp compares to your peers. It might result in revising job descriptions or making adjustments to salary bands. So really the pay audit should give you more information that might be useful in evaluating these other things as well. Next slide.
And then finally, to finish up here on internal pay equity, this is something that we've seen a renewed interest in evaluating as well, because there's a view of some that the pandemic actually may have made this already kind of wide divide between rank and file and the C-suite even worse when it comes to the amount that they're compensated. So what are companies really looking at in this area? I would say kind of the two main things are, one, companies are evaluating, do we need to expand who's actually eligible for bonuses or equity awards in our company? Maybe historically that had been really reserved for the very top of the house, but maybe it makes sense to maybe reallocate a little bit and save some and spread it broader across the organization so that more people could share on the upside of the value that's being created, and help kind of pay for itself long term. The downside, though, sometimes is obviously increased administrative burden, and then there's not an unlimited number of dollars, right? So the money's got to come from somewhere. But that's something we're seeing companies reevaluate. And then lastly, I would just say generally evaluating all their pay practices and just fair pay in a very tight labor market. So being sure that there's not the pay equity issues, being sure that they're doing everything they can on the diversity front, and compensating everybody equitably so that they can avoid employees leaving if they feel like they're being treated unfairly and or underperforming as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you to Dario and the whole V&E team for including me on this. It's been great, and I'll hand it back to Dario.
All right, thanks, Allison. Next slide. So thank you all for joining today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. After the program, you will get an email with a link to the recording as well as the presentation slides. In that email, you'll have the opportunity to submit any other questions to Allison or me. Thanks again. Appreciate you guys attending the presentation. Have a great rest of the day.